There are days you never expect to become turning points. For me, it was a Tuesday morning in September, when Portland was still veiled in mist, and from the 7th floor office overlooking the Willamette River, I truly believed I was living what people called the American dream. I am Heidi Klum, the former creative director of Verity Creative Lab, a digital media agency once named one of the top 20 breakthrough agencies in America by Marketing Insight 6 years ago. I left New York after a devastating project collapse and moved to Portland, hoping for a quiet restart. I didn't choose this city because it was a creative hub, but because it was quiet enough to hear my own voice again. I invested what I had, gathered with my earliest partners in an old cafe, and wrote out the first plan for Verity. I told myself that even if I failed again, I would know I had poured my heart into it. We didn't follow the beaten path of traditional advertising, instead focusing on emotional marketing, with real experiences and real stories at the core. My early campaigns for Earthed, an organic food brand, and Gia & Co., a home goods label, earned the trust of consumers, and from there, clients came in steadily, gradually. I became known as a voice that helped bridge brands with communities through genuine connection. Everything began to slip out of place early last summer. When the board proposed expanding to the East Coast, I didn't oppose it, but I wasn't fully on board either. I understood that the identity we had built needed time to root, and we couldn't just copy-paste our Oregon model onto New York without restructuring the team. But my opinions started getting ignored in meetings. I began noticing a shift in how Marcus Doyle, my co-founder and once my closest friend, treated me. Marcus was the first person I called when I had the idea to start the company. Back then, we were two failures in the industry, hugging each other in the Portland rain and promising never to let money or power destroy our friendship. But that promise, it seems, no longer held meaning. Marcus began meeting clients alone, attending pitch sessions without inviting me. I was called in only to sign off on contracts that had already been finalized. When I asked, he would smile and say, "We have to stay flexible to survive." "Heidi, don't try to control everything," I smiled back. But inside, I was filled with questions left unanswered. I still believed in our friendship, hoping it was just work stress. But when the biggest campaign of the year, an emotional initiative called The Thread That Binds for Fashion Giant Weaver United, launched with full credit going to Marcus and the East Coast team, I could no longer justify anything to myself. The idea had been mine, born in the early months of the year, from conversations I personally had with Weaver's CEO, whom I had introduced to our agency. I knew exactly how they wanted to inspire customers using stories from single mothers in Mississippi who did embroidery. I had visited each sewing facility with them, recorded every story, and mapped out the video series that later went viral. But on the day of the campaign launch, I was seated backstage, as if I had never existed in that journey at all. That morning, Marcus called me into a private meeting room. He wouldn't meet my eyes, just handed over a folder and said that the executive team had agreed to restructure, and I would no longer serve as creative director. "We think you need a break. Heidi, you're exhausted, and the new team has a different approach, more aligned with our growth pace. You'll always be a part of Verity, but perhaps it's time for change." I looked at Marcus, the same friend who had shown up unannounced at my mother's funeral in Chicago, the one who had sat with me for hours in our early recording sessions, the one who used to say that if Verity had a soul, it was my storytelling. And now, this same man was delivering a farewell from a pre-printed script, as though every emotion had been formatted in advance. I said nothing, just nodded, signed the indefinite leave form, and walked out of the office under the awkward gazes of the younger team members. I caught a ride but didn't go home. Instead, I walked along the river as a light rain began to fall. Memories flooded back nights spent scripting until 3 a.m., the times I turned down lucrative deals that went against Verity's values like a reel played in reverse. What hurt most wasn't just the theft of credit or the betrayal, but the slow erosion of trust, the creeping realization that I was no longer part of the house I helped build with my own hands. Worse than being dismissed was the silence. They never said it outright, just quietly replaced me, gently pushed me out of the race with a silence carefully designed to leave no trace. I had once believed that Verity's success was proof of my own worth, something I could proudly call my personal legacy. But now, it was just a name I was no longer allowed to claim. When I finally returned to my small apartment near the Pearl District, the clock read 8 p.m. My phone showed no calls, no messages, not from Marcus, not from the board, not from anyone in the team I had mentored since day one. I made a cup of ginger tea, but let it sit until it went cold. The kitchen light reflected off the window pane, illuminating the tired face staring back at me. The same eyes that used to sparkle when speaking about a new idea, now hollow with quiet defeat. I sat there for a long time, not crying, not angry, just gazing into the darkness outside and realizing I had entered the loneliest terrain of all the bottom of self-doubt. I didn't know what would come next, but one thing was clear. They had pushed me out of the company I once saw as my lifeblood. They had severed what I thought were unbreakable ties, and they had betrayed me not with a punch, but with polite smiles and silent consensus no one dared speak aloud. But sometimes, to begin again, you must fall hard enough to know where the bottom is, and it is in that quietest place where something begins to shift. Silence is the most unsettling state after a betrayal, because it tricks you into thinking everything is over when, in fact, it has only just begun, the first week after leaving Verity. I barely stepped outside my apartment, not out of sorrow, but because I had no idea which direction to go. My laptop remained on the desk, the whiteboard still cluttered with notes from old campaigns, and the research files I had once used for the Thread That Binds campaign sat quietly in my hard drive, like fragments of memory that had yet to be erased. Each morning I woke up, made coffee, browsed through media industry news as a habit that hadn't yet been replaced, and wondered whether I was still clinging to a past that no longer belonged to me. But then, an email from a young freelancer who had once worked with me made me sit upright. In her message, she said she was sorry to hear I had left Verity, that she had always admired how I led projects with genuine emotion and how I protected the subjects in each campaign as if they were family. At the end of the email, she asked whether I offered personal mentorship because she was launching a campaign about Asian women in tech and wanted to learn how I crafted stories. I didn't respond right away, but that afternoon, I reopened Helix, an emotional language analysis software developed by an old friend and gifted to me years ago. I used it to revisit audience comments on the campaigns I had led. Short, honest notes from viewers brought me back to the reason I started in the first place. It wasn't for fame, nor for money, but because I believed that marketing could be an emotional bridge between businesses and the communities they serve, a place where personal stories could become the thread that binds millions of people together. And no one could take that belief away from me, except myself. I started over with something simple, a name. After many nights of reflection, I decided to form a small creative unit called Lumen Narrative Studio. focused on media projects for underserved communities groups often overlooked in commercial campaigns. I no longer had an office or a budget like before, but I had what no one could replicate: experience, perspective, and a small network of people who still believed in me. I emailed a few former clients I had worked with directly, not asking for a job, but simply posing a question: if there were a campaign built on authentic value and lasting connection, would they be interested? Not everyone replied, but 2 did within a day. One was Dana Brooks, the brand director at Earthwoven Herbal Teas, whom I had worked with 2 years earlier. The other was Nate Ellison, founder of Urban Seeds, a nonprofit supporting immigrant communities in Atlanta. They didn't make promises, only said that if I had a concrete proposal, they were willing to hear it. So I began drafting a simple pitch deck, no frills, just concept frameworks, background research, and a content roadmap grounded in emotional storytelling and educational value while working on it. I had to relearn many things that a team used to handle for me: writing scripts, building storyboards, researching consumer data, but in doing so, I gained a deeper understanding of what makes a campaign truly impactful. I realized how much I had once leaned on an old system, and that this was the first time I was doing everything from nearly zero. Yet in that solitude, there was a strange sense of relief. No KPI pressure, no executive review boards, no meetings filled with polite nods. Just me and a few others who genuinely believed that telling a story the right way could still make a real difference. Then came the first real blow. A front-page article on Marketing Insight reported that Verity was preparing to sign a media deal with Urban Seeds, one of the clients I had just pitched to less than a week earlier. The article quoted Marcus, saying that Verity was partnering with Urban Seeds for a project called The Roots We Grow to highlight emotional stories of immigration. I stared at those words on the screen, not with anger, but with a hollow feeling. Nothing in that headline was new. It was the exact name I had used in the proposal I sent Nate. I didn't know the full story, but I understood that once again. My ideas had been taken. I emailed Nate, but he never responded. A part of me wanted to give up, to believe that this game wasn't meant for someone standing alone. But just then, I received a voice message from Dana Brooks. She said she had just watched an old video I had created for Earthwoven 3 years ago, and she still believed it was the most impactful campaign the company had ever done. If you want to do something like that again for our new product launch, let me sponsor part of the production, she said, her voice so sincere it made my throat tighten. For the first time in weeks, I cried not from pain, but from the realization that I hadn't been erased completely. I used the small sponsorship from Earthwoven to hire a young production team that had freelanced for me before, borrowing a friend's studio to film the first video in a new campaign called Her Hands, her voice featuring women in Oregon's rural textile industry. I wasn't aiming for flashy media coverage, just quietly uploaded the video to a secondary YouTube channel and ran a modest emotional ad campaign with a budget of $300. Yet within 10 days, the video had surpassed 200,000 views and received hundreds of heartfelt comments. A blogger who specializes in human-centered marketing shared the video on her platform, calling it a remarkable comeback for real storytelling. From that point on, the momentum began to shift. Dana called to offer me a strategic advisory contract for Earthwoven's entire campaign for the next year. A natural cosmetics startup called Clay Bloom reached out via email, saying they were willing to fully fund a project if I agreed to take on the role of creative director. Everything was still small, still in its early days, But I knew this time I was rebuilding from something no one could ever steal: intuition, sincerity, and the ability to see true value in the smallest of things. There are moments when you realize that truth doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to be revealed at the right time, in the right place. The campaign, her hands. Her voice had begun as a modest attempt to prove I could still lead a story that touched the public's heart. But I never expected the video to become a catalyst that surfaced what had long been buried beneath the surface. 1 week after Earthwoven officially announced the campaign I had advised on, I received news that Verity had filed a copyright complaint against the video, accusing it of resembling a project they were developing in parallel called Threaded Stories. I wasn't surprised. They had always found ways to silence me, and this was no different. But what they didn't expect was that I had registered the script, the concept, and the video structure from the very first day of production, with confirmation emails from my copyright attorney, along with a complete thread of emails exchanged with clients even before Verity had submitted their funding proposal for a similar project. I made no public statement. I simply sent all documentation to Earthwoven's legal office 3 days later. Verity received a formal notice demanding the immediate withdrawal of all related content and a halt to their Threaded Stories campaign to avoid legal infringement. The news was leaked, not by me, but by a former content team member at Verity who had witnessed how my materials were often reused without attribution. An anonymous article began circulating in a popular creative industry forum under the headline, "When Creativity is Distorted by Power." The writer described in detail how my original ideas had been stripped of my name, altered, and rebranded as someone else's, most notably Marcus Doyle. Real names were not mentioned, but the implications were clear to everyone. Verity's initial response was silence, followed by a short press conference denying all accusations and asserting their adherence to ethical creative standards. But beneath the surface, a tide had started to rise. Those who had once stayed silent began to speak. 2 former colleagues reached out to tell me they had been instructed to edit out my name from the internal website's co-founder list months ago. Another, who had worked in the legal department, sent me a draft of the Urban Seeds sponsorship agreement with a clear footnote referencing my earlier pitch materials. I realized then that I didn't need the press or major media to tell the truth. It was already leaking through the smallest cracks. Then the most unexpected thing happened. Nate Ellison called me one morning, his voice tired but sincere. He said he felt like he had been pulled into a game he couldn't control, that after initially declining my proposal, he had been pressured by his advisory board to sign with Verity due to long-standing investor ties. But after witnessing how they handled the narrative and their public denial of what was clearly my work, he regretted the decision. "If you'll allow it, I want to return the entire project to you," he said, without hesitation. I sat in my small kitchen, holding a cup of coffee still steaming, and stayed silent for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that this was a turning point. Once again, quiet preparation had led to tangible consequences. I agreed, but requested that we start from scratch, using no part of the original material, and that full creative control would belong to Lumen Studio. After that call, everything seemed to shift direction. My name began to reappear in professional forums, not as someone pushed out of the system, but as a new model for ethical creative entrepreneurship. A small but influential magazine called The Hum published a feature article titled "Success as Revenge: The Rise of Heidi Klum and What Marketing Needs to Relearn About True Value." One line stayed with me. She didn't destroy the old. She quietly built the new and let the contrast speak for itself. But just as I thought things were beginning to settle, Marcus called. It was the first time he had reached out since our last meeting in that conference room. His voice was low, tense. He said Verity was in disarray, with several partners raising questions about the transparency of recent campaigns, and investors demanding a full review of all copyright contracts from the past 2 years. I didn't speak, just waited for him to finish. After a pause, he asked, "Is there a way to resolve this without dragging everyone down further?" I looked out the window, where late autumn sunlight shimmered on the river, and replied, "I've already resolved it by choosing not to be part of those negotiations anymore." Marcus said nothing, then hung up. No apology, no explanation, and oddly, that brought me peace. I realized not everyone is willing to change, and not every relationship needs saving for closure to happen. Some losses don't need to be mourned, because it's in that very rupture that you begin to see your real worth more clearly in the days that followed. I threw myself into work with a renewed focus. The project with Urban Seeds was rebuilt from the ground up, this time using a narrative rooted in personal migration memories combined with visual art. I collaborated with Ethiopian painters, a young Syrian director, and a team of editors from the Latinx community in Houston to produce a hybrid series blending live interviews with motion animation. I wasn't chasing views. I built lasting connection by letting audiences take part in telling their own stories. Each video ended with a personal message from the storyteller, no calls to action, no product plugs, just a human voice reflecting on their path to a place they could finally call home. When the first video launched, I had no expectations, but within 48 hours, it was shared by a Vietnamese-American director who had once been Emmy nominated, and later by a producer at a major streaming platform. They called the videos breath of life content, the kind of work the creative industry is forgetting how to make. Meanwhile, at Verity, I heard 2 senior employees had resigned, stating in their LinkedIn posts that they were seeking a more honest working environment. A blog post from a younger team member went viral as well, detailing their experience of being trained to unlearn emotional marketing under the new leadership. I didn't share those articles, nor did I comment. I let everything find its place on its own. The truth has a way of spreading without force, and I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. There are moments when you don't need to say you're ready to return, because everything in the way you walk, look people in the eye, and make decisions speaks for itself. That morning, I attended a partner meeting with Earthwoven and Urban Seeds at a shared workspace in downtown Portland. There were no flashy backdrops, no elaborate sound systems, just a small room, soft amber lighting, a few tables pushed together, and printed documents neatly arranged in order on the table. There were no oversized company logos or business cards, only one simple line, Lumen Narrative Studio. But in the eyes of those seated around me, I sensed a different kind of anticipation, not hesitation, not doubt, but something steadier. I presented the plan to interlink content from our 2 active campaigns, aiming to build an independent video platform for emotionally driven community stories. In this model, the storyteller would not only be the subject, but also the editor and narrative architect. I named the project Echo, as a way of affirming that what is genuine will always resonate, even if it takes time. When I finished, the room was silent for a few seconds. Then everyone nodded in unison. They didn't ask about budgets or projected views. They only asked when we could begin, technically speaking. I still lacked the infrastructure to support such a platform, But that was exactly why I felt I was on the right path, because from everything I had endured, I had come to understand that a remarkable comeback is never about budget or reputation. It's about the right people, the right moment, and the right belief. And for the first time in many months, I no longer felt like someone asking for an opportunity. I was making a choice. I returned to my old apartment, the one that had witnessed so many nights of quiet struggle in front of a computer screen, and began restructuring the entire operational system of Lumen, no longer working on one-off projects. I organized it as a real studio with a content department, a consumer psychology research team, a post-production unit, and a special division dedicated to analyzing emotional response data. I wasn't chasing technology, but I knew that to protect what's authentic, I needed sharp tools to detect what isn't. For 3 weeks straight, I interviewed candidates, not starting with degrees, but with one question: what story have you told that you still remember? Their answers told me who was here for a paycheck and who was here for the mission. Then a call from the East pulled me out of my comfort zone. A representative from Seed House Media, one of the most influential social fundraising organizations on the East Coast, reached out after watching the Urban Seeds video. They said they were looking for a partner to lead the communications campaign for a nationwide startup competition focused on social enterprises. They wanted someone who not only understood storytelling, but who had personally been rejected, pushed out of the system, and had rebuilt from scratch. I heard each word as though I was being described from a profile I hadn't written myself. I didn't answer right away. I asked for 2 days to think. I spent that time walking around Mirror Lake, the same place I used to run during my early years in Portland, the same place I once stood alone after being cut from Verity. The lake remained still, the trees shedding their leaves as always, and I realized the only thing that had changed was me. I no longer feared being sidelined or betrayed, because now I knew, even if someone steals your name from a campaign, they cannot steal how you see the world or how you make others believe in kindness. That night, I sent an email agreeing to partner with Seed House with one condition: I wanted Lumen to hold sole creative authority and implementation rights. No subcontractors, no outside interference. 3 hours later, they replied with 2 simple words: agreed. Around that time, I heard that Marcus had been asked by Verity's board to step down as creative director, not because of our past, but due to mounting internal complaints about his opaque leadership, discriminatory practices, and exploitation of creative labor. I felt no joy, no vindication. I simply thought that anything hidden long enough will eventually surface if you're patient. A week later, I ran into Marcus by chance at a small nonprofit communications summit in Seattle. He sat in the second row, quiet, never took the mic, never joined the networking sessions. After my presentation on Echo, as I walked into the hallway, he stood there, pausing briefly when he saw me. I nodded without speaking. He looked like he wanted to say something, but I took the step forward first. "There's no need," I said. Everything that needed to be said already was, just not in words. He nodded, and his gaze no longer held its old defensiveness. Then he turned and walked away. That encounter wasn't for closure. It was simply confirmation that I had stepped into a new chapter, one where the old characters no longer held central roles. Back in Portland, I held the first full staff meeting at Lumen's newly leased studio in the redeveloped industrial district near the river. I didn't give a long speech. I just said one thing: we don't need to create something shocking. We just need to tell the truth in a way that makes people want to stay and listen. The room stayed silent, then broke into soft applause, like a promise spoken without sound. that day. I walked out of the building, looked up at Portland's signature gray autumn sky, and knew I was ready for whatever stage came next, not because I had anything to prove, but because I was exactly where I needed to be to build something of true worth. I didn't come back to retaliate. I came back to continue what I had never stopped doing, telling stories that matter, at the right time, in the right way. There are victories that don't require anyone else's recognition, only the certainty that you're on the right path and no longer need permission to keep going. That November, the Echo campaign officially launched with screening events held in 3 major cities, Portland, Atlanta, and New York. There were no flashy press conferences, no famous guests, just carefully selected, intimate venues where the storytellers sat among the audience and watched their lives unfold on screen. Each screening ended with a dialogue circle, where the audience was invited to share feelings, memories, or simply remain silent and listen. I didn't stand on stage, didn't give lengthy introductions. I sat quietly in the corner and watched how real stories found their way into the hearts of strangers. Online, excerpts from Echo spread with an organic rhythm, not driven by any viral campaign, yet gradually shared by social organizations, universities, and community groups as valuable reference material. What surprised me most was an email from a media professor at UCLA who had incorporated Echo into his ethics and storytelling course and wanted to invite me to speak to his students. It wasn't a loud kind of recognition, but the kind that made me sit still for a few minutes, looking at the screen, knowing that every quiet choice I had made was echoing back. Around the same time, Lumen Studio received a collaboration offer from a rising streaming platform that wanted to produce a documentary series on personal transformation after crisis. They weren't looking for people with flashy profiles, but for those who had lived through loss and rebuilt a sustainable foundation on their own. I didn't rush to accept. I simply asked to draft the pilot script first. 2 weeks later, they sent over a contract that emphasized full creative control would remain with me. When I signed it, I didn't feel thrilled. I just felt like I was walking a quiet but solid path that left a mark without needing to shout. Meanwhile, Verity was in decline after Marcus stepped down from leadership. Financial reports revealed multiple unaccounted expenses, and their new campaigns were criticized as hollow, lacking the emotional breadth that had once defined their brand. Many longtime clients withdrew, including Earthwoven, Urban Seeds, and Clay Bloom. I didn't reach out to anyone or ask them to return. I believed that those who left for the right reasons would know when it was time to come back, and if they didn't, then it was never meant to be. A detailed article in an industry journal analyzed Verity's slow collapse, calling it the inevitable result of confusing control with creativity. They didn't mention me by name, but the cover image featured a still from her hands, her voice, placed as a clear point of contrast. I was invited to speak at a creative media conference in Chicago, the city I once left behind after my first major failure years ago. Returning felt like stepping into an old room once abandoned, now reopened under a new light. As I stood on stage, facing hundreds of faces, I didn't deliver a speech. I just shared a short part of my journey, one I felt was enough. I spoke about how the fall wasn't what changed me. It was how I viewed that fall as a test of dignity, that even if someone takes your title, your office, or the team you built, they cannot take away the way you believe in what's right. I ended with a question. If one day you are pushed out of something you created, would you have the strength to rebuild it, not out of revenge, but to prove that what's real will always find a way to live, The room was silent, then followed by applause, not loud, but steady, like a quiet agreement that what I had said wasn't philosophy, it was truth. In that crowd, I saw Emily Shaw, a former colleague from Verity. She approached after the session, held my hand, and said one sentence, "I should have stood by you back then." But I didn't have the courage. I didn't blame her. I just nodded and said, "That's okay. You being here today is enough," because I understood that some relationships don't need to be restored in full, only acknowledged as having once gone wrong, and that alone can be enough from then on. Lumen didn't need much advertising. Projects came one after another. We didn't chase numbers. We measured success through the depth of engagement and the genuine involvement of the community. I kept the habit of watching old footage, not out of regret, but to remind myself not to let time wash away the reason I chose this path. Marcus later became an independent brand consultant, no longer living in Portland. I heard he moved to Denver and opened a creative space for students. Some say he has changed, others say he hasn't. But to me, that no longer matters. I don't need to know who was right or wrong in someone else's ending, because I have already rewritten my own, an ending without loud triumphs or endless applause, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has finally found their rightful place. One night, sitting alone in the studio after all the lights had been turned off, I played Lumen's first video, the one where an immigrant woman looked straight into the camera and said, "I didn't come here to change the world. I just want the world not to forget that I exist." I looked into her eyes and saw the person I once was. My existence had been overlooked, dismissed, cast aside, but I didn't scream to reclaim my place. I took the long road, built my own stage, and stood on it calm, clear, and deep enough that I no longer needed to explain anything at all,